And it's my tremendous pleasure to welcome Manish Bapna, the president of the Natural Resources Defense Council, who will be our player coach. Musonda Mumba, the director of the UN Rome Center for Sustainable Development. Our friend Shah, the president of the Rockefeller Foundation and former director of USAID. And Andrew Steer, the president of the Bezos Earth Fund, which I'm sure you have all seen made a major announcement just a few days ago. Manish?
Great. Thank you very much, Jamie. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Really delighted to welcome you to this incredibly timely session, Climate Change in an Interdependent World. As Jamie mentioned, my name is Manish Bapna. I'm the president and CEO of the Natural Resources Defense Council. We have a distinguished panel here with you today, Musonda Mumba, Shah, and Andrew Steer. And this session is taking place at an absolutely critical moment in time. We are 38 days from the start of a major global climate summit in Glasgow, United Kingdom. This is the most important global summit on climate since the landmark summit in Paris back in 2015 when the Paris Agreement on Climate Change was signed. And this week is a particularly important week, as most of you know. Heads of state and government are at the United Nations to talk about a wide range of issues, including climate change, food security, and the energy transition. I had the privilege this past Monday of moderating a roundtable with 40 heads of state that was also co-chaired by the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and the United Kingdom Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who will be hosting the talks in Glasgow. And the exam question for that meeting on Monday is the same question I'm going to pose to our three speakers today. The question was that the UN's kind of own assessment of where current country commitments are to tackle climate change aren't enough. They would put us on a trajectory of 2.7 degrees. Yet the Paris Agreement argues we must aim for a goal of 1.5 degrees of warming. We have a major gap in ambition and a major gap in delivery. What will it take to actually hit our target? How do we get from here to there? So with that, I'd like to start with Andrew. How goes the battle, Andrew? What gives you hope? What keeps you up at night? Andrew, you might be on mute.
Thanks. Great to see you, Manish, Musonda, Raj. What a treat to be with you all today. Look, since we met in Paris for the big Paris deal in 2015, sort of two things have happened. Thing number one, it's got much, much worse than we anticipated. Climate change is not a future event now. It's a current event, more so than scientists were even projecting. So its storms are more intense. Heat is greater, rainfall becomes less predictable, where you have flooding, you have acidification of the ocean. All of these things have now are having an effect, especially on those who are more vulnerable. It's really a moral issue that we have not yet really grappled with. Second thing that's happened, though, is that the whole idea of the Paris agenda looks like it is being supported by evidence. The Paris deal was set up as a voluntary mechanism to say, look, we don't yet have a global governance system that can force a treaty so that you as a nation are obliged to do certain things. We just didn't have the politics for that. So it was really designed as a sort of voluntary idea that countries could put in their own offers, so to speak, and their obligation was to be transparent about that, to report on that, and every 5 years to come back and really have that reviewed. And the understanding was that the first time round, it would be nowhere near enough to solve the problem. And sure enough, that happened. The first set of the so-called NDCs were weak. We're now at the second phase. There's good news and bad. The good news is that over 100 countries have now committed to net zero by the middle of the century. I would not have predicted that, and very few people would. That is better than we had thought. More than 2,000 large companies have made a similar commitment. And indeed, 200 of the largest companies have said, we're not going to wait to 2050. We are going to reach net zero by 2040. This is a much greater leadership than we anticipated, which is good. And perhaps the most remarkable of all is the financial sector, which has traditionally not been a friend of climate action. It is generally, because it tends to be short-term in nature, tends to be very conservative. So banks and funds and so on have generally not helped the environment, not helped climate change. They are now also stepping up. And so we have now $90 trillion of assets under management, which are now committed to go to net zero by the middle of the century, which is quite remarkable. Having said all that, that's a long-term vision, and it turns out it's easier to make a long-term commitment than to actually deliver a short-term plan to get there. And so when you talk about ambition, you will hear some people say, oh, it's fantastic. And that's because long-term goals are clear now. And others will say, we're falling over a precipice, and that's because we are not seeing leadership in the short term. And what Paris is all about is trying to bring together those sort of short-term efforts, which can be in terms of tons of carbon, but it can also be policy issues like we will not allow the internal combustion engine to be sold in our country after, say, 2030 or 2035. So it can be policy issues too. So good news, Manish, bad news.
So Musonda, let me turn to you. Andrew gave a wonderful kind of state of play on what's giving him hope and what's keeping him up at night. Mm-hmm. Your reflections on what Andrew said and your own thoughts on.
No, thank you so very much, Manish, and lovely to see you, Andrew, and you, Raj. It's really interesting. I would have said that Andrew has actually answered the whole question, but perhaps I'm reminded of this fantastic book by Roman Krznaric entitled "Good Ancestor." I think I'm really, and I stand to be corrected. I don't think that the older generation has been a good ancestor in terms of the Earth and planet that we're leaving for the future generations to come. And so in really sort of adding a little bit to what Andrew has said, I mean, let's just talk about lived experiences. I've spent the last nearly 15 years in Nairobi, and when the pandemic hit last year in March, there was flooding all over the Lake Victoria Basin. And you can imagine, as you know, all the news media were talking about social distancing, etc., and all of that, and please, this pandemic is very dangerous. People were actually being taken into all these spaces, particularly by the Red Cross, to make sure that people that had been moved from flooded spaces were also secure. And we begin to see, and just listening into the last panel, the element of preparedness. And I think this is where we see the intersection of this pandemic and climate change conversations. We saw all those fires in Siberia. We saw the floods in Germany and Brussels. And so this also begins to talk about our collective plight as humanity on the planet. What is it that's keeping me awake at night? I think what's keeping me awake at night is sometimes it's almost like we're having a deja vu moment. How are we slightly going back instead of moving forward? I think with this pandemic has been very telling of our fractured relationship with nature. The fact that we all live in cities, most of us live in cities, how do we connect in terms of our food systems? In fact, I think we're competing space right now with the UN Food Systems Summit, which is happening simultaneously. Right now, our very food systems have been detrimental to our climatic and planetary boundaries. And then last thing, what I would like to say, what gives me hope is the young people. I think the young voices, the young people, regardless of the fact that they lack in experience, I think they have in boldness and real attitude to just go, go, go. In fact, when I was at the last COP in Madrid, COP 25, it was fascinating. They were all like, you're either with us or please move out. We're really moving. And they've been the ones calling out, let's keep fossil fuels in the ground. Let's keep those fossil fuels on the ground. Let's think about the innovations, the changes that are really meaningful for our planet. So for me, it's really exciting, and I'm really hoping towards COP26 that we're going to see more amplified voices, more inclusivity. And as we say, you know, with the SDG 2030, let's not leave no one behind. Because what this pandemic has done is that it has really brought about nearly 2008 poverty levels. How do we leapfrog from that And with the compounding of climate change impacts, how do we rethink how we live on this planet? So I'll leave it up at that.
Thank you so much, Musonda. Just both how interconnected many of the crises that we're facing are, whether it's COVID, inequality, climate, nature, but then also how interconnected the response needs to be. Raj, I would love for you to pick up on that. I know you had a very seminal piece in Foreign Affairs quite recently that I'd encourage the audience to take a look at. Maybe you could say a few words about all of this.
Well, thank you, Manish, and it's great to be with Musonda and Andrew, of course, who are just great leaders doing such important things, concrete efforts that are making the world better. So that's fantastic. And frankly, that's what we just need much, much more of, concrete efforts that are making the world much better at a time of real crisis. I was reflecting on the reality that in the midst of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill on a boat in 1941 agreed to something called the Atlantic Charter. And they made the determination before they won the war, before they knew the outcome of the war, that we would do some bold things together to prevent the next one. And, that led to the Marshall Plan, where America expended 2% of its GDP to help rebuild Western Europe. It led to the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions that have maintained some degree of financial stability and convergence in the global economy over 8 decades. And it helped set the stage for things that decades later became movements to end poverty and bring kind of justice and equity to the farthest corners of the globe. Just recognizing what One World is all about. We're all connected. And I guess Andrew and Musonda were great in describing the situation we're in. I couldn't agree more. And I think what we need now is a COVID charter. We need to recognize that it's not okay for Africa to have an immunization rate around 4 to 6%, while all the new vaccines go to other parts of the globe. And to recognize that we're facing a decade of potential divergence, and we can do something about it. I would advocate for a few concrete steps that are an effort to do something about it. The first is I think we have to reinvigorate investments to fight climate and achieve development outcomes. It has waned significantly in recent years. The increase in official development assistance during the COVID crisis has been minuscule and totally not up to the task. We should commit to every industrial country committing 1% of its GDP to efforts to fight climate change and invest in development in emerging and lower income countries around the planet. Second, we should ask countries themselves to increase their share of public expenditure. If you look at less developed countries, last year achieved 14% of their economy, of their GDP, as revenue collection and domestic expenditure. That is nowhere near enough, even on a good day, to achieve the SDGs and to fight climate change. Some have estimated, Jeff Sachs has estimated, that you'd need twice that just to have a serious effort to achieve goals that have already been set. So we've called for a 25% target that every country on earth should be able to raise and spend 25% in the context of their government spending, and heavily weighted towards the purpose of achieving the goals laid out in the Sustainable Development Goals. Third, the Bretton Woods institutions were incredible innovations when they were created 80 years ago. And you can look at a lot of things created back then and say, wow, that was novel, innovative, and impactful then. And respect that, but also recognize that it's time to reinvent, new solutions. And our team has proposed a few specific actions using the special drawing rights mechanism at the International Monetary Fund more aggressively and effectively, changing the capital adequacy requirements of the multilateral banks to allow for $1 trillion of new lending, and embracing novel new public-private collaborations that actually Andrew has helped design and develop with his colleagues, Gordon Brown and others, that could really change how we think about what public-private can achieve in multilateral finance going forward. Fourth, I think we just need more Gavis, more Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, more public-privates that really make a difference. We're committed at Rockefeller to an effort around a global energy alliance, which we'll talk more about post-Glasgow. But these big problems require science, technology, and private partners to stand with governments. And finally, our fifth part of that proposal for the COVID Charter is just asking the UN Security Council and world leaders in the G7 and G20 to actually hold development and climate enterprises, initiatives, and institutions accountable at a political level. It's not okay, as Andrew points out, to show up at Paris, to show up at Copenhagen, to keep making commitments and then fall farther and farther behind against the goal. So that's what our COVID charter is, but it's really just a call to action and a sense of maybe during our own crisis, we can find a boat, look at each other and say, let's make sure this doesn't happen again in a much worse form when climate change really starts to disrupt the realities of our global economy.
Raj, that was great. Thank you for those 5, clear points in terms of an agenda of how to respond to these crises. I'd love to just kind of continue with that flow around concrete things that we collectively need to do to tackle the climate crisis and obviously the intertwined inequality and COVID crises that are connected to it. Andrew, I was wondering if you wanted to maybe jump in a little bit more on other concrete steps you feel we need to take.
Well, there are 2 kinds of concrete things that are needed. There are the kinds of policy changes and investments that just need to be expanded. And Raj, for example, at the moment is leading the charge on the creation of a really remarkable new institution called the Global Energy Alliance that will bring serious philanthropic money to the issue of energy. I don't know whether, Raj, you want to say a word about that, but we just need to get the policies in place, and we need to get the investments in place. But there's also a second kind of action, and you don't need this all the time, but there are certain points in history where you actually do need institutional changes. And again, back to Raj, it takes away the Rockefeller Foundation. 50 years ago, the Green Revolution sort of, incipient like 70 years ago, I guess. At the creation that Rockefeller did together with others in creating sort of the consultative group on international agricultural research, really ramping up that kind of thing. Think about, 20 years ago, where the creation of the Global Fund, for example, and Gavi. And at certain points in history, you need an institutional change. And my sense is this is such a point, and we're not seeing it. At a time when we need multilateralism to be stronger than ever, it is actually not strong. We're not even seeing, for example, in the multilateral banking system, we're not seeing the multilateral leadership that we need to. The World Bank is a wonderful organization. I spent a good deal of my career there. I love it. It needs to step up and say, my goodness me, this is not business as usual. We actually need to go the extra mile. And it may well be that this is a time, you think about it, next year, we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the famous Stockholm Environment in 1972. Stockholm Environment meeting in 1972 created UNEP, United Nations Environment Program. Now, the United Nations Environment Program, which is a wonderful program and has done a great job, could be given more power. The United Nations, what UNDP is doing, fantastic work. We should be thinking about how do they all work together? How could we really seriously increase the resources that they have? And so I sense that we are missing something right now. Now, having said that, I do believe there's wonderful things going on. So, for example, I think we're going to see in Glasgow the bringing together of the nature agenda and the climate agenda in a way we've never done before. And it's really quite remarkable. My organization that I have the privilege of leading is the Bezos Earth Fund. 2 days ago, we announced $1 billion for conservation in support of what's called 30 by 30. 30% of all land and sea to be conserved by 2030. A wonderful initiative. It relates to biodiversity, but it also relates to climate change, and it relates to poverty reduction and social equity. And so bringing these all together makes a huge difference. And we've been working with some other foundations. And yesterday we were able to announce $5 billion for conservation on the part of 9 philanthropies and foundations. So you are getting some pretty exciting things happening. And what we really need to do is ask, so in energy, are we in the right place? Are we accelerating rapidly enough? Nature-based solutions, are we doing the same? What about the built environment cities? What about energy efficiency? Not really going very well. The way we're looking at things at the Bezos Earth Fund is we're looking at the revolutions that need to take place. We think there are about 50, and that includes getting rid of the internal combustion engine, developing the hydrogen economy, shifting to plant-based foods, and so on. About 50 of those, actually. And what we're trying to do is monitor them. And Manish, you've been heavily involved in this yourself in the System Change Lab that World Resources Institute introduced. We're monitoring those, and then we're asking, what is the secret sauce that takes one of those over a tipping point? And can we share that secret sauce with each other? Can we identify the blockages that institutions like ours and Raj's and Musonda's can come in and help remove the bottlenecks so that you make change irresistible and unstoppable?
Thank you very much, Andrew. The critical importance of institutional reform, creation, creative destruction, perhaps, as well as the need for really understanding these revolutions. We only have about 3 minutes left. Musonda, I really would love to come back to you, hear your thoughts on this, and then we'll try to have a final word before we wrap up.
Great. I just want to add to what Andrew has said. The United Nations Development Program, really, some of the commitments and the announcement that the philanthropists have made, we have existing structures, we have existing initiatives. For instance, the Biodiversity Finance Initiative, Biofin, that UNDP has really been working on. And let's talk about the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. They are mechanisms that exist, and we are the largest agency within the multilateral system that has, offices in over 150 countries. So that in itself also speaks to the policy and the institutional framing, as it were, in terms of supporting. And lastly, but not the least, UNDP, in fact, announcing today, set up the UN Energy Hub, the UNDP Energy Hub, and to really look at how do we really bring about this change for renewable energy. We have no time to waste, I'm afraid, and the race is on, as we said yesterday in that event, for Nature for Life Hub.
We have just 2 minutes left. So we're going to go to each of you, just one last kind of thing that you're proud of that you'd like to share with this audience. Raj, I'm going to turn to you first.
No, I'll give my minute to Raj, by the way.
No, I'll give it back
he hasn't had a second bite of the apple.
I know.
I'm good. I think I'll 2 quick points. The first is crisis has always been opportunity if taken up and really forced through. And so we should use the chance to immunize everyone on the planet as a way to build health equity into the global health architecture. We should use the fight against climate change as the path to create hundreds of millions of new jobs. And that's what we intend to do with the Global Energy Alliance. We should use this moment where we respect and understand Earth as a rare asset that needs to be protected to advance initiatives like the one Andrew just described. The second point is private alone can't do it. You got to have strong public leadership. And so I know we feel that similarly, but we got to keep this up, and efforts like One World help mobilize a global community to hold public leaders accountable. Now's the time to be bold, not the time to step back.
We are at time. This has been an incredibly stimulating conversation. Raj, Musonda, Andrew, thank you so much. Just one final reflection. It was about 6 years ago to this date when the SDGs were being finalized in New York at the UN General Assembly. And a few months later, the Paris Agreement was signed. And it was a spirit of kind of inspiration and bold agenda. Incredible moment. But as we think about how to deliver that, I think what you heard today from Musonda, from Raj, from Andrew, is what it'll take in terms of the same creativity around institutions, around policies, around politics, in order to help realize that agenda. Incredibly important moment in time. Jamie, we're very thankful for you for organizing not only this session, but the broader One World Summit.
Thank you so much, Manish. Thank you, Musonda, Raj, Andrew, and all of you, and the hundreds of thousands of people around the world who are joining us.